At the beginning of your attack phase, choose one of the following. Draw a card, enter charge 1, banish target level 1 Signy on your opponent's field. You may pay 3. If you do, return target Signy on your opponent's field to its owner's hand. Wow, what an insane ability. It's so flexible, resources, free removal, can even open a hole without giving the opponent an enter. I wonder why this card doesn't seem to see any play. Oh, oh no. This is Liwat Memoria. Besides Servant Sharp, she's one of the only 2.5 colorless Signy in the format. Of all the colorless Signy, she's the only one who lacks the Primal Tone class. Instead, she's an angel, and included on Liwat is probably her most unique aspect, her enter effect. When Liwat Memoria enters the field, she checks all your public zones for face-up Signy, who are both not colorless and not angels, and if she finds any, she immediately trashes herself. This means that Liwat is one of a very small selection of cards that actually gives a meaningful deck building challenge. You either must run a deck full of servants and angels, or you have to find a way to cheat Liwat into play. Doesn't sound too hard, right? After all, Exia, considered by many to be one of the best cards in the game, is an angel. And there's plenty of other angels that see regular play. Heket, Haniel, Arquin, Artemis, and even some more niche cards like Automula or Tamamoria, Mastema, Martial, Brynhildr. All of these cards are angels, and nobody's really batting an eye if you're running them, angel deck or not. However, Lawat's weaknesses extend much further than just the surface level requirements to meet her enter conditions, and despite the card's apparent strength and flexibility, you must be wary when considering the card and her parent class, as in truth, Lawat is less of a deck building challenge and more of a deck building trap. I want to make it clear that this discussion isn't meant to call Lawat a strictly bad card, nor do I think anyone who enjoys playing the Signy should give her up. She's certainly a unique and somewhat interesting Signy, and I understand that a lot of people who play this game enjoy deck building as puzzles rather than trying to make top tier competitive decks. After all, any deck even considering the possibility of running Lawat probably isn't being designed for competing at the highest level. Rather, I want to use Liwat as a way to talk about card design and deck building theory. Wecross deck building has some interesting aspects to it, in part because you're building both around the content of your main deck, which you need to draw, and the content of your Elrig deck, which you always have access to. As a result, most decks are built around their Elrigs first and their main deck second, but that's not always the case. Decks built around a specific class, for example, our main deck comes first. We need specific pieces to make them function, specific game plans that are tied together by synergies. And sometimes it's those cards that make us make hard decisions. For example, by simply existing, Liwat explicitly asks a very interesting question of anyone trying to build angels. And that is, if you're building angels, why not just push the extra few cards to be able to run Liwat? It's this question that I think catches most angel players in the trap, because it's a false question. It assumes one very important fact, that Lawat is worth playing in the first place, that if you were to remove the enter ability, she would be a meta staple and ran in nearly every deck. After all, she was designed when you could only run cards with the colors of your Elrigs, meaning Lawat broke that design rule a little bit by being colorless. She could be played in any and every deck. A card with this much flexibility and power had to be locked down somehow, if not by color, and that's why its enter effect exists. However, we have the foresight now to know that the lack of locking Signy to certain colors really doesn't end up lowering main deck diversity, and if anything, just increases the amount of creative options to consider when constructing your deck. A colorless level 3 Signy with 10,000 power and a decent effect probably wouldn't have altered the game that much, both when it was released in P07, and especially not now or into future sets. In talks with other players, I have come across a sentiment that, without the enter effect, Lawat would see play in meta decks. And to some extent, this is probably true. While it isn't the most powerful option these decks have, she does fill a unique slot as a free removal that can be salvaged with Super Alessa Saber. So having her as a one of, similar to how many decks run Orochimaru or Memoria, does seem appealing. However, her issues begin before we ever reach her enter effect, which is why, even when there are shells that can ignore this effect, there really hasn't ever been an even remotely competitive deck that leans on Liwat. To understand why she's not a great card, we need to first understand what kind of decks we can run her in. So, how good are angels? The answer? Not very. At least not for what Liwat wants. I'm not going to spend too much time here going in depth about angels, because that topic definitely warrants its own discussion in the future. But because Liwat is obviously stuck with the class, I'll spend a brief moment here to lay some foundational concepts to get an idea of where the strength of a Liwat decks lie. I've been playing Angels for a very long time. I've used several different deck makeups with several different game plans. I've played lists both with and without Liwat, so I'm very familiar with the class's capabilities. Some of these may be personal takes, but everything I'm saying here is based on my own experience against some of the highest level players in the game. Angels do not have access to very good removal. There are some decent options, but overall the class really struggles to push damage on its own. Most of its stronger removal options are limited to early game and limited to specific colors, making it hard to build a consistent game plan around them. The class doesn't have great access to interaction either. Enter Burn is basically non existent in any functional form in Angels, and while the class has slightly better tools for discard, neither has enough cards to make interaction a primary game plan. What Angels can do very well is give overwhelming access to lots of resources, as well as play a decent defensive game. The class has filtering, the class has walls, and the class can create lots of Enter if given time. The Watt sounds perfect for this kind of game plan. After all, if I have all this extra Enter, she herself provides a powerful Enter sink for us to use. And that is true, Lawat can work, but she's rarely ever the first pick in any given situation, which is why her true strength is her flexibility, right? Wrong. Flexible cards don't win games. Flexible decks do. What does that mean? Well, here's the thing about flexibility in Wixoss, or at least Diva Selection. It's genuinely not an important trait for a main deck card to have. If a card has a very powerful effect and happens to have other things that it can do, sure, it can be pretty strong. Exia, for example, is a defensive monster, obvious to anyone who's played against it, but on top of that, she also denies freeze pretty well for some reason, so this already extremely strong card can do even more in certain game states. But generally, flexibility is reserved for the Elrig deck, since those are the cards you always have access to, and thus, those are the cards you most want to be usable in any given situation. Looking at Elrig decks of top performing lists, you may notice that the vast majority of cards included increase the number of cards in hand, many of them even letting you filter from your deck or salvage specific cards from your trash. The reason for this is fairly simple. While both filtering and removal are things main deck cards can do, at the end of the day, you need Signy to deal damage. If you always have removal but can't find your stronger Signy that filter, you'll still lose. Meanwhile, if you have a lot of Signy that create holes on their own, you can use your Elrig deck's filtering to find them. This may seem like an obvious concept. Most people who play this game learn this idea very quickly, even if they aren't being explicitly conscious about it. However, what this means is that because Elrig decks consist of 5 to 7 cards that can generate Signy, you don't need individual Signy that do lots of different things. You can instead run lots of Signy who each do a single thing very well, and use those Elrig deck cards to find them consistently. Compare Liwat to Anna Mirage, for example. Liwat seems more flexible on the surface, and as an individual card, she maybe is. However, Anna Mirage is more flexible as a game piece because she is very good in the situations where she's very good. That sounds stupid, but that's seriously all a card needs to be playable. Lawat at best is just a generic hole opener, but Anna Mirage, even with less effects, is so much more. First, she can be pitched to Igona and fetched with Super Alexa Saber without giving up a guard, which are significant aspects of the card, but may not be satisfying given that's just interacting with other cards in the deck. Beyond those two things, however, Anna can also rise down Signy to re-up them without wasting your retire. She can trigger Exia in the main phase when you can still interact, and kill many popular level 2 Signy that Lawat would have trouble dealing with efficiently. And on top of all that, she's a 13,000 power Signy. This means, in the event that you need a Signy who doesn't die to some of the most popular removal assists in the game, namely Machina Smash, she can be that for you. That extra power also makes her relatively difficult to get off the field, as some decks may not run a single efficient out to such a large Signy. Sure, there aren't a lot of situations where Anna is better than Lawat, as Lawat is decent in any situation. But Anna is great in the situations where you want her, whereas Lawat never really is. And the situations where Anna isn't good, it's so easy to just not pick her. To instead pick, say, a Memoria or a Polaris, the efficient card filtering offered by most Elrig decks makes the sort of flexibility that Liwat pretends to have kind of unnecessary. Additionally, part of Liwat's false flexibility stems from the fact that her effect is BOAP, or beginning of attack phase. Once again, this is a discussion likely best saved for another time, but BOAP timing is arguably the weakest timing for an effect to have, mostly because it limits the user the most on what they can do. Liwat's flexibility drops even more as a result, since you pretty much know what mode you're choosing by the time you play Liwat, and can't change your mind based on what your opponent does, since her effects will already have happened. But unlike effects with main phase timing, you also can't combo her chosen effect with any main phase tools you'd like, such as using a piece to burn the enter given by her vanish mode, or using a discard effect from a spell to get rid of a card bounced to your opponent's hand. Lastly, and most importantly, Liwat forces your deck to be built in a specific way. Even if Angels were amazing, being locked into a single set of cards is not ideal, and in turn makes your deck much, much less flexible. And while Liwat herself has many different modes, in the grand scheme of a game, they just aren't that impactful. Liwat is never going to make up for how much she warps your deck, needing several turns in order to accrue enough value to feel worth it. This is a massive, massive downside that requires a massive, massive upside, similar to another card who comes with an extremely important trait Liwat lacks. Ereshkigal was the 50th most played Signy at the Florida GP, right below discard hater staples Tristan and Amoeba, and right above discard lover staples Firefly, Squid, and Bruno. She's an iconic card that, similar to Liwat by simply existing, warps game plans and game states in unexpected ways. Slower decks utilize her as a finisher, as they can preserve life cloth for longer, and usually lack efficient removal, and aggressive decks can use her as a way to clear boards without giving resources. She outs Exia, messes with combat math, and is overall a strong and skill testing card. Similar to my points about Anaraj, she's even a 13,000 power Signy, giving her additional protection against common removal and making her a stickier threat should the opponent live through her assault. But how is any of this relevant? Well, this, in my opinion, is Liwat's second Achilles heel. Being a 10,000 power level 3 Signy stunts Liwat's strength and reduces the number of game states where she's actually useful by even more. 10,000 power may not seem immediately relevant. As stated earlier, the difference between 12,000 power and 13,000 power is significant, as it lets Signy dodge common removals such as Machina Smash, Ultra Superheroes, and Haneo Pomegranate. And the other threshold powers to dodge removal occur before 10,000, such as 8k, 5k, and 3k. Everything else doesn't really differentiate, and either just cares about level or doesn't care about anything at all. However, 10,000 power is significant. Similar to how 12,000 power Signy can't attack to get rid of 13,000 power Signy, such as Arash, Anna, and Nobu, Liwat can't attack to get rid of 12,000 power Signy, which is really, really important for your level 3s to be able to do. Exia is a remove on sight threat. Liwat can't attack over her. Same with Gabolg, Memoria, Osagatsune, Yukime Memoria. Leaving these Signy on the board for multiple turns in a row is disastrous and immensely lowers your chances of winning. All of these Signy are 12,000 power, and all of them Liwat can't get rid of on her own. Even her bounce effect just lets you get a little more damage in. Your opponent, now with the Signy in hand, can just replay them the following turn. Level 3 10Ks do see play though, right? What makes them different from Liwat? Well, to put it simply, Liwat is just significantly worse than these other 10Ks. Just take Orochimaru for example. This Signy represents the ability to permanently remove most Signy, can guarantee a servant, and can be used along the much stronger white synergies that exist in the game. Cards like Chigusa, Flathrow, and Dragon Maid represent extremely efficient damage, terrifying to be across the table from. Cards like H2, Miko Miko Memoria, and Musica Memoria all skew resource states heavily, often enough to gain an advantage. Even some of the weaker 10Ks, such as Pyraluke Apex, Nanashi Memoria, and Real Memoria, all have multiple strong abilities that allow them to have far more flexibility than Liwat's single trigger ever could. Furthermore, 10,000 power is also way easier to remove itself. While actual hole openers may not care about the difference, Liwat can just be attacked over by vanilla level 2s, which is a big deal given that every color has a meta level 2 that sees regular play. This means your opponent can field 2 level 3s and still knock down a Liwat no matter where any of those Signy are placed. It's maybe a minor detail, but for a card that specifically wants to live multiple turns in order to generate resources, it's a pretty rough issue to have, especially since other similar Signy don't have the same problem. Additionally, it's not like the 10,000 power removal is non existent. Cards like Werewolf and the aforementioned Dragon Maid are generally used to attack through level 2s, but they'll happily take attacking over a Liwat instead. There's also cards like Ex Memoria, or Nanashi Selection, or BP, or Patra, or Pandora. Additionally, there is a lot of minus 3k and minus 8k in the game, which can be combined for a total of a minus 11k, a number very special because it specifically does not hit 12ks. They're safe from these combos, but Lawat is not. And the worst part, and many may disagree, is that Lawat arguably could have been a 13,000 power Signy. This is a power reserved mostly for Rise Signy, but as stated before, Ereshkigal also has a 13,000 power. This helps Aresh be especially threatening, as many of the slower decks it wants to eat up are running Machina Smash, which, as repeated multiple times now, can't stop Ereshkigal on its own. Now, you may be thinking that Ereshkigal has a much greater downside. Eating 2 of your cloth is pretty scary, and if your opponent does have the ability to stop damage, or just gets lucky with life bursts, your Aresh can do more harm than good. However, this downside only exists if you actually play Ereshkigal. Hear me out. Ereshkigal can always just be more Enter, or discard fodder, or a pitch for Igona, but Lawat's downside is present from the moment you begin the game. Not only is she colorless, but your entire deck has been warped in order to support her simply being an option. Her downside is far worse, even if it's not as flashy or explicit about it, and her upside is laughably less impactful, not even coming close to matching Aresh in its game swinging capabilities. Lawat would be much more of a consideration at 12,000 power, but I'm not convinced she would see that much poor play even at 13,000. At least then, putting her on the field is a threat to the opponent, forcing them to either answer it or drown in your value. They can't just leave it and then attack over with her in level 2, or remove it super easily and then not have to worry about it. There's just so many things holding her back, making Lawat a pain to try and make work in any capacity. But at the end of the day, that's the point, right? We got an interesting and flashy card design that challenges the player unlike any other card. She's unique and interesting, and her effect is fun and wacky. She's not meant to be serious or competitive, she represents Wixoss as a game with cool abilities and creative players. Except, not really. Lawat reads really interesting the first time you see her. Everything about her, from the art to the frame to that damn Enter effect, are just so unique. But unique doesn't equal interesting, and Lawat, in my opinion, is ultimately not very interesting as a game piece. Maybe the first time your opponent sees Lawat, they'll do a double take, but more often than not, there will be absolutely no reaction to the card being placed on the table. She either trashes herself, or she doesn't, and that's the entirety of her effect. Compare this to any other similarly unique card in the game. When Ereshkigal enters the field, it's a big deal. You're trashing 2 cloth, getting to see what life burst you may be giving up, and your opponent has to trash their entire field. It becomes a guessing game of what bursts may remain, as well as what resources they can afford to spend to stop her incoming damage. Both players are very involved in the simple act of playing an Ereshkigal. Building an Oodles deck is complex and a game of managing proper and early mid game survival and actual consistent access to the late game power of the Signy. Playing with its cards is a game of manipulating trash, and it's always suspenseful to see if Umar flips a free Signy. The amount of effects that occur, cards moving between zones, and important decision making caused by a single effect in summoning Oodles is unmatched, making the card a skill testing play experience. Even cards like Paradise Universe and Endless Punchline can challenge you to take risks with how you build your deck, but allow you freedom in matching your local meta with what you should include, such as what level 1s you can get away with. Although both of these have their own issues from a card design perspective that could fuel an entire discussion on their own. Really, there's just nothing truly interesting about the gameplay of Liwat. She's not a great payoff, she's not very impactful, and all she really does is limit your deck building options to a pool of around 80 cards, the vast majority of which being unplayable and thus making all somewhat competitive Liwat decks read essentially the same. Angels has so many more interesting payoffs than just a random low value BOAP level 3 colorless 10k. Take a look at Pele, who has one of the most unique effects in the entire format, or Gaia, who can similarly replace opened holes with Exias and is otherwise a superior value engine. Thanatos lets you play a Lancelot plus soft counter refresh. The Valkyrie combo can be deadly out of nowhere. Even Zeacius, who I've been very vocal about disliking, basically does what Lawat does, but way better. Liwat is a trap, both for the competitive viability of any Angel deck, but also for any player who wants to play something interesting and bases their decision off of how a card reads, rather than how it plays. And you really can't blame these players. Again, on paper, Liwat does seem interesting, and you really aren't going to feel its shortcomings until you've placed it on the field a few dozen times. Until that point, she'll gladly just lie until your deck is so deep in the trap that there's no hope for escape. I understand that most of the concepts I discussed in this video are probably well known and practiced by most of this game's veteran player base. Saying Lawat isn't a great card isn't the most groundbreaking statement, nor are any of the general game theory ideas I laid out. And while I don't think it changes the core concepts of this video, it doesn't help that Dissonance Diva, which has significant impact on the format's meta, came out before this video could get finished. While this was very much primarily a rant about a card I have a lot of opinions on, I do hope there are players who learn something here that they can apply during their next deck building session, whether that be with Angels or otherwise. Similar concepts can be applied to cards like Gable, Phalaris, and even Remember Memoria, cards that are meta staples but really shouldn't be auto included in every deck. Thinking more critically about game pieces in your game plan will have an immediate impact on your deck building, as well as your play. WeCross is such an interesting game, and I think there's always new ways to improve across every aspect of it. Part of that includes avoiding traps and pitfalls, and considering how cards exist as game pieces alongside one another and not as individual entities. The complexities of Diva Selection are vast and may seem insurmountable, which, in my opinion, is why it continues to be a fun and engaging format. But it's also what makes it so intimidating for new players. To be clear, I'm glad Lawat exists, because she challenges us to think harder about our approach to deck building, and to consider how the typical game is actually played. She's a learning experience for both new and old players alike, and that's the key that makes her interesting, not how she functions as a game piece. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, please do so below. I have lots of ideas for Wheatcross in the future, and that includes potentially doing a follow up to discussions like this. I know I'm not the greatest or smartest player in the world, and there are definitely people who have a better understanding of everything I talked about here. I just think Wheatcross is among the most interesting card games I've ever played, and I want to do it justice by showing more people how much potential it has. That's it for me. Keep playing Wheatcross and keep improving at this amazing game.